name is Hannah Lilly. I work for the Secretariat of the Pacific Community, or the SPC, an intergovernmental agency providing advice to Pacific Island governments. I'm based in the Fiji Islands and I am legal advisor to the SPC European Union Deep Sea Minerals Project. So I advise 15 Pacific Island governments on the development of new policy and law for engagement with deep sea mineral activities. As well as providing advice to Pacific Island governments, the Deep Sea Minerals Project also runs workshops and training programs and has produced a number of publications, all of which can be found on our web pages at www.sopac.org/DSM. I'd like to start by providing a little context to the Pacific Island region. Some Pacific Island countries are least developed countries, or LDCs, and all Pacific Island countries are small island developing states, or SIDS, according to United Nations groupings. This means that they share characteristics which give rise to particular vulnerabilities and challenges. For a start, Pacific Island countries have very small land masses and are surrounded by very large areas of sea. In fact, 98% of the Pacific Island region is actually ocean. The islands can be very remote, often very far from each other, and Pacific Island countries are all characterised as developing countries. That means that the populations live in varying degrees of poverty or hardship. Pacific Islands have a very narrow resource base. That means there are very few national industries taking place within Pacific Islands to generate income. Some Pacific Islands do benefit from natural resources revenue, largely from fisheries, also some on-land minerals in a couple of the larger countries such as Fiji and Papua New Guinea. And there's also some tourism industries, notably in the Cook Islands and Papua New Guinea. But many of the countries rely largely on foreign aid assistance and also on remittances from nationals who are living overseas. Pacific Islands generally all also have very small populations. Indeed, one of the countries I work with, Niue, is, I believe, the smallest country in the world in terms of population, with just about 1,200 people living on the island. Pacific Islands, and particularly those that are very low-lying atolls, such as Tuvalu or Kiribati and parts of the Marshall Islands, are vulnerable to natural hazards such as cyclones and flooding, and sea level rise currently faced as a result of climate change really does present a huge challenge to the already scarce land resources available on such tiny islands. Similarly, waste management and food and water security can also be real challenges. So for those reasons, Pacific Island governments are generally quite anxious to find new ways to make their countries more economically sustainable and to improve the standards of living for their people. And that's the context in which the new emerging industry of deep sea mining in the Pacific region is arising, and why it is of potential interest to several governments and nations across the region. Now, I'm just going to say a little bit about how an individual nation has rights over deep sea minerals. So international law sets out which parts of the ocean fall to individual countries' sovereignty and which bits of the ocean are common areas, which is the international seabed, known as the area, and the water column, known as the high seas. In brief, a country can claim national sovereign rights over all marine resources found up to 200 nautical miles measured from the coastal baseline. And this marine space is generally known as a country's exclusive economic zone, or EEZ. Some coastal countries with certain geological features can actually measure further out from the edge of their EEZ along the seafloor for a further 150 nautical miles to claim what's called an extended continental shelf, giving national jurisdiction over the seafloor and the seafloor's mineral resources up to 350 nautical miles from the coastline. If those zones, the exclusive economic zone or the continental shelf, would overlap with a neighbouring country, then an agreed boundary would need to be negotiated, usually along a median line, so that can shorten the national marine jurisdiction. But following these rules, many Pacific Island countries, and particularly those that are archipelagic, so they're made up of a number of islands spread across sometimes quite a wide geographical area, and also those that are quite remote and do not have close neighbours, tend to have really vast EEZs, particularly when considered in proportion to their land and their population size. Just taking one example, the Cook Islands, it's made up of 15 different islands, between them representing just about 200 square kilometres of land area. But measuring the exclusive economic zone and an extended continental shelf claim, the marine jurisdiction goes up to 2 million square kilometres. So that's almost actually 200 square kilometres per person, per Cook Islander. So you can see it's a really vast sovereignty geographically. And that's very important because the natural resources contained within that ocean space, including fisheries, has been the main focus in the past, but now also seabed minerals. Those natural resources fall to the government to manage, and the proceeds of any exploitation of those natural resources is generated for the state and for the nation. You may be wondering why there is a special European Union project aimed particularly just to look at deep sea minerals in the Pacific Islands region. And the reason is both that Pacific Islands do have these huge maritime jurisdictions, and also that geologically the Pacific Ocean is particularly abundant in deep sea minerals, and that includes within the EEZs, which variously contain a large number of seamounts, which is where cobalt-rich crusts are found. Also across the Pacific Ocean, we've got a range of hydrothermal vent sites where seafloor massive sulfides, or SMS, deposits are found. And again, across the Pacific Ocean, we have areas of abyssal plains and ocean basins, the deepest parts of the ocean, where polymetallic nodules are known to occur. Since the 1970s, there have been geoscientific surveys conducted across the Pacific region, and these have shown strong SMS potential in 5 Pacific Island countries or in their maritime jurisdiction. Those are the countries known as the Pacific Ring of Fire countries, located in the volcanic arc and ocean trench. And those are Tonga, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu and Fiji. Other Pacific islands, including Kiribati, the Cook Islands, Tuvalu and Niue, are known to have nodule potential. And a third group of countries, including the Marshall Islands and the Federated States of Micronesia in the Northern Pacific, are believed to have strong cobalt-rich crust potential on their seamounts. So although these surveys have been relatively limited in their number and in their scope, we do have quite a good source of information to suggest that Pacific Islands have strong deep-sea mineral potential within some areas of their maritime jurisdiction. And this geological potential has led to commercial interest in the Pacific region. Those 5 Pacific Ring of Fire countries mentioned have each issued a number of exploration licenses covering large areas of their EEZ seafloor. The companies conducting this work include Nautilus Minerals, a publicly listed Canadian company, Neptune Minerals, sometimes trading under local subsidiaries known as Blue Water or Bismarck, which is a private investor-backed company headquartered in the United States. And thirdly, KIOST, a Korean state-funded institution. So you can see there's three quite different types of companies all operating already under exploration licenses in the Pacific. And those licenses give the companies an exclusive right to explore in their allotted areas. And these licenses are particularly for SMS, seafloor massive sulfide deposits. And under those licenses, the companies are permitted to carry out various scientific studies in order to be able to assess the feasibility and viability of mining in the future. Also gathering oceanographic and environmental biological data in order to be able to measure impacts and to assist government make decisions in the future about permitting potential mining projects. Other Pacific islands, including Cook Islands, Kiribati and Federated States of Micronesia, where there are known to be promising seabed deposits, have not yet issued any exploration licenses, but have been working to put in place policy, legal and administrative measures necessary in order in the future to be able to open up parts of their EEZ for exploration. The 5 countries I've mentioned who have already issued licenses all have done so using existing legislation that was designed originally to cover on-land terrestrial mining, but that they have been able to use or adapt to cover the seafloor. Many other Pacific islands are also focusing now on improving marine spatial management mechanisms and focusing on biodiversity conservation measures such as marine protected areas. And so there's work underway to examine how to integrate deep sea mining into those plans. Deep sea mineral exploration, the stage that the vast majority of the industry is at the moment, is rather expensive. A single cruise may last, say, 30 days, and that would be at a cost of at least $100,000 per day. So it's not a negligible investment for these companies. And it may actually be difficult for such companies to raise that level of income at this stage, given that the industry is untested. So the investment that they're seeking from their shareholders or from private individuals is quite a speculative investment. For that reason, although there have been a large number of exploration licenses issued in the Pacific, not all of those are actually under active exploration currently. The companies instead tend to prioritise their resources to certain sites of interest. And in that regard, Nautilus Minerals has focused its efforts for several years now on one site known as Solwara 1, that's pidgin for the ocean, in Papua New Guinea. And Solwara 1 is in the Bismarck Sea, about 30 kilometres from the coast of New Ireland in Papua New Guinea, and to the other side, East New Britain province. It's a weekly active hydrothermal vent site where Nautilus Minerals has identified SMS deposits at around 1,600 metre depths, which have been assessed to contain really quite high grades of copper and also zinc, silver and gold. Nautilus has been operating on this site since the 1990s, and more recently spent 2 years working on an environmental impact assessment, the first EIA undertaken for a deep sea mining project. That resulted in quite a comprehensive environmental impact statement, which can be found on their website called Nautilus Cares. So you can Google that website. Following that EIS, Papua New Guinea government issued to Nautilus the world first deep sea mining lease in January 2011. As mentioned, this was done by government using the legal powers and regime provided in existing mining laws, whose coverage was amended to include the seafloor. The size of the mining site at Solwara 1 is small. It's 0.11 kilometres squared. The mining process envisaged is that there would be 3 different types of remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, operating on the seafloor, controlled from a mining vessel at the sea surface. The ROVs between them will basically cut up the chimney-like hydrothermal vent structures, chopping those into smaller pieces, collecting them into piles, in order for those to be lifted up to the surface vessel via a long riser pipe stretching from the vessel down to the seafloor. That rocky material, once it arrives on the vessel, would then go through a process to be separated out from the seawater that has also come up through the pipe. And that water would be returned back to the seafloor at the same depth from which it was extracted, is the proposal by Nautilus. The rock material will be transported from the mining vessel onto barges that will then take it off to on-land processing centres. At the moment, it's envisaged these will be located outside of the Pacific Islands region. There aren't any such processing or refining facilities in the Pacific Islands region now, and perhaps it might be unlikely that there would be any built in the region, given the large water and energy requirements for such facilities, and also waste management issues. So if the vessel is coming in sort of to the outer edge of the EEZ, and then the barges are all taking the rocks out of the EEZ, you can see this means that an offshore mining project, such as the Solwara 1 project, may have little or no on-land presence in the Pacific island country that's licensed the project. Now, clearly that can pose some regulatory challenges, how to be monitoring and controlling an operation that you have very little direct contact with. But of course, this may also be a positive aspect in terms of reducing adverse social and environmental impacts on the Pacific Island countries. Although Nautilus Minerals received that permit to mine from the Papua New Guinea government in January 2011, at the current time, 2014, no mining has commenced. There have been a number of delays caused in part by a dispute that arose between Nautilus Minerals and PNG government, and that dispute was around government's failure to make a requisite payment for the equity stake in the project that PNG government had elected to take, which they were entitled to do in accordance with their mining laws. However, that equity stake came with a requirement to pay funding into the project, which PNG government did not do in accordance with the timetable. That issue has now been resolved, and so the current situation is that the necessary mining equipment, the vessel and the ROVs, the building of that equipment is underway. And I believe Nautilus are projecting commencement of mining now to be around 2016. Once that mining commences, Papua New Guinea government have advised that they anticipate the benefits coming into the nation financially to be in the region of $142 million, and that's income that will be coming from primarily royalties and income tax, and also some benefits from the company's local expenditure and employment of Papua New Guinea nationals. So moving on to the legal aspects of deep sea mineral management, the main source of law is the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is a large international treaty. It's now been signed by 165 state parties and also the European Union. And it covers a range of different aspects of the management of ocean space and living and non-living marine resources. It's what I like to call an all-or-nothing treaty. Parties cannot sign up to one bit of it and leave out another bit. Parties are not permitted to have reservations. If a state has signed up to the convention, it signs up to every single one of the rights and obligations it contains. Possibly for that reason, the convention was many years in negotiation, decades in fact. And although the text of the convention was agreed and adopted in 1982, there were a further 12 years of discussion and negotiation after 1982 before the convention finally entered into force. And although the convention covers a wide range of ocean issues, the main reason for many of those prolonged negotiations was divergent views between different nations about deep sea minerals, and more particularly a controversial aspect was Part 11 of the Convention, which is the part that deals with deep sea minerals and the seabed beyond national jurisdiction, the seafloor known as the area, with a capital A. The area which is managed by the International Seabed Authority, an intergovernmental agency that was created by the Convention for that purpose. So while the Convention was being drafted and discussed, there was quite a range of disagreement, and particularly between developing and developed countries, about how that regime beyond national jurisdiction for seabed minerals should be managed, and how individual nations should be able to access those deep sea mineral resources found in international waters. Eventually, an implementing agreement pertaining to Part 11 of the Convention was agreed in 1994, addressing some of those issues, and it was at that point that the Convention entered into force. Because I'm talking about the Pacific Island region, I'll just mention that one of the countries who I advise, Fiji, was the very first country to sign up to the Convention, and in fact another island nation that falls under the jurisdiction of our project, Timor-Leste, was one of the most recent signatories to the Convention in 2013. The Convention's stated aim is to establish an order for the seas to promote equitable and efficient utilisation of their resources, also conservation of living resources, and the study, protection and preservation of the marine environment. So as you can see, the Convention embraces a multiplicity of interests and in fact potentially conflicting uses of marine space and marine resources, with both trying to conserve and protect the marine environment alongside recognising the interest in using or exploiting marine resources for economic development and for human benefit. Now, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea provides that coastal states have sovereign rights over all of the living and non-living natural resources within their national jurisdiction. So Pacific Islands have exclusive rights to access, explore or exploit, or decide not to explore and exploit any seabed minerals found within their exclusive economic zone or on their continental shelf. And no third party can enter the jurisdiction and study or extract or do anything to those minerals without the government's permission. So Pacific Island governments can decide when, by whom and on what terms, including financial terms, any seabed mining shall occur within their maritime jurisdiction, if indeed it shall occur at all. There is, however, a caveat to that sort of absolute right over the EEZ, as the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea also sets out a number of state obligations and other parties' rights pertaining to national marine space, and those rights will need to be recognised and respected by government in implementing its deep sea minerals policy and decision making. Those rights include rights of navigation by other ships, also submarine cabling, marine scientific research, and there might be other marine use that governments are interested to protect, such as fishery stocks and fleets. A particularly important area, also relevant here, is a coastal state's environmental obligations under international law. So the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and other treaties also contain certain requirements that must be taken into account by the state in developing and implementing deep sea mineral decisions and regulation, and in issuing any licenses for exploration or mining. So the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea itself contains an overriding obligation that applies to all states to protect and preserve the marine environment. There's also an obligation on states to protect rare or fragile ecosystems, and that duty is going to be particularly relevant in relation to seafloor massive sulfide resources, as those are found on hydrothermal vent systems, which are generally agreed to be rare and fragile ecosystems. The Convention also contains provisions requiring states and international bodies, such as the International Seabed Authority, to monitor the risks and impacts to the marine environment posed by any activities that they have permitted, and to take appropriate measures to minimise the likelihood of serious impacts or pollution accidents. So that's the Convention on the Law of the Sea, but that's not the only source of environmental law obligations that are going to be relevant for deep sea minerals. The 1992 Convention on Biological Diversity is also a very important legal instrument. It aims to preserve biodiversity and has particular emphasis on protecting ecosystems in situ. And one mechanism for doing that in relation to deep sea minerals is to set up a network of biologically representative marine protected areas, or MPAs, across the ocean. And those areas should be set aside and should not be touched by human activities. And that mechanism is aimed to ensure that if parts of the ocean are going to be disturbed, disrupted, destroyed by mining, then there will remain equivalent and large areas of the seabed with representative environment that will remain intact. And as I mentioned, a number of Pacific Island countries are engaged in developing such marine protected areas or marine parks. Currently, there's the Phoenix Island Protected Area in Kiribati. The Cook Islands is planning a large multi-use marine park across its EEZ, and Palau also recently announced another very large marine protected area across its EEZ with certain no-take zones. There are also a number of shipping conventions generally overseen by the UN's International Maritime Organization, which are going to be relevant for deep sea mineral work too, because of course exploration and mining of the seabed requires use of vessels at sea. These conventions are quite numerous and also regularly updated and amended, and they include within their scope issues such as the reduction and prevention of pollution at sea, controlling hazardous materials at sea, human health and safety at sea, preventing collision, and ensuring that vessels are in good repair and that the crew of vessels are properly trained. There may also be relevant regional conventions. For example, in the Pacific, many Pacific Island countries are signatories to a treaty known as the Noumea Convention, which also contains relevant provisions aimed to prevent, reduce and control pollution at sea, and various provisions seeking to ensure sound environmental management, including by way of prior environmental impact assessment of any activity or projects that are likely to cause significant harm to the marine environment. I also wanted to mention the 1992 Rio Declaration on the Environment and Development, because the Rio Declaration also contains a couple of principles that are very important for deep sea minerals. One is known as the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle applies in a situation where there is a lack of scientific information, but where there is an interest to proceed with a development project nonetheless. And the precautionary principle provides that proceeding in those circumstances of scientific uncertainty should only be done in a way that is extremely cautious and careful, with proactive, proportionate mechanisms in place designed to predict and prevent environmental damage. And those mechanisms should be put in place even if we don't have scientific data or proof that this damage is going to occur without those measures. So the precautionary principle places the burden on the proponent or the project implementer or the developer, requiring them to err on the side of caution to try to mitigate, avoid and prevent any potential damage in advance. Now, the precautionary principle found in the Rio Declaration, although normally the Rio Declaration is a non-binding declaration, it's not a treaty or a convention. However, the precautionary principle, as stated in the Rio Declaration, has been adopted by the International Seabed Authority in the regulations that they've issued for contractors within their jurisdiction, the area. And the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea provides that when individual states are establishing their own national laws and rules for seabed mineral activities, then they must take into account any existing international standards. And so for deep sea minerals, that clearly includes the regime adopted by the International Seabed Authority. So it's a convoluted way of saying that in that way, the precautionary principle really should be followed by individual countries in their domestic laws for deep sea minerals. And so the precautionary principle really appears now to be a binding requirement when it comes to deep sea mineral activities. And indeed, in other areas of environmental law, I believe it's arguably gathered customary law status in any event. But the situation is a little clearer in that regard, specifically for deep sea minerals. The Rio Declaration also contains another principle I wanted to mention that highlights the importance of concerned citizens being properly involved in government decisions that may have a significant impact on the environment. So this notion of public participation and consultation is also very relevant to deep sea mining. Not only because of the potential for environmental impact, but also because we're talking to the exploitation of natural resources that are generally perceived to be a common resource shared by the citizens of that country Although they are managed by the state via the government, they actually belong to the nation as a whole, both the current population and also future generations. So there's really a lot of sense in government making their deep sea mineral regimes and decisions inclusive and participatory, and trying to make sure that the population of their country know what's happening, are properly informed, and have an opportunity also to raise any queries or concerns. And that's particularly easy, actually, if your country has a very small population, like some of the Pacific Islands. Ultimately, if there is going to be deep sea mining, then we would recommend government should aim to establish that they do have what's termed a social license for that mining project to proceed, i.e. the population of the country are broadly in support of the new industry proceeding. A very important aspect of the international law of deep sea minerals is that each individual coastal state ultimately is responsible for the deep sea mineral activities that may be carried out with its permission within its national jurisdiction, or indeed under that state's sponsorship within the international seabed, the area. If, for example, the international community or any third party objects to the conduct or the impact of such activities, or perhaps claims damages or compensation, then it falls to the government to be responsible, and the government will be primarily liable. Unless and until government has been able to pass that responsibility and that liability effectively to the company that is carrying out those activities. And the way for government to do this is by imposing appropriate standards and requirements on the company and monitoring and enforcing those rules. Sometimes referred to the government having effective control over the company. So you can see the situation there. You've got probably a foreign national company that's carrying out the mining, but the government ultimately responsible for any adverse impacts or damages caused. So it is essential for Pacific Island governments who are considering permitting deep sea mineral activities to make sure that they are able to exercise such effective control over the companies, both to prevent any environmental degradation or disasters or unanticipated or unwanted effects occurring in the first place, and also to protect that country, that small island developing state, from being called upon for compensation or clean-up costs arising from the acts of others that country can ill afford. So this is a very important part of the legal framework for deep sea minerals, and the way in which such effective control is achieved must include having in place national laws and regulations that meet relevant international standards, aimed to limit the activities of deep sea mineral companies to within appropriate parameters and operational standards, and to place appropriate checks and balances on what is permitted and what is prohibited. Having laws on the statute books will not be enough on its own. Those laws must also be monitored and enforced by the state, and this will require administrative measures such as an identified authority within government that is equipped with appropriate legal regulatory powers and duties and objectives to properly regulate the industry. So the country's law and policy regime, as well as setting up or identifying this authority, should also contain a comprehensive and transparent licensing regime. So people who want to undertake deep sea mineral activities within that country's jurisdiction, it's very clear to whom they will need to apply, what information they will need to provide, what criteria the decision will be taken against, in what time frame, and what the license terms for the particular activities the applicant wants to carry out will be. For example, how long is a license issued for, how large an area of the seabed may it include, specifically what activities are permitted and what activities or impacts are prohibited or will trigger more stringent controls or extra regulatory measures. And what will the obligations of a licence holder entail, including environmental management requirements, vessel standards, also the financial arrangements and payments that the company must make to government. So all of this needs to be contained in a country's national offshore mining laws. The country's national environmental laws are also going to be key, and these will need to contain an environmental impact assessment process, preferably one that has regulations tailored to deep sea mineral development. And again, clearly identified authorities and functioning mechanisms for EIA processes and permitting processes. So in a nutshell, that is what my job involves in the Pacific region, assisting governments to develop policies and laws along those lines, and preferably in consultation with the nation's public and other interested stakeholders, including the industry and also including civil society groups and campaign groups who also have an interest and perspective that government needs to take into account. So developing these policies and laws is quite a challenge, not least because there's very little precedent. This is a new emerging industry, and it's quite difficult to set operational parameters and to identify exactly where to set the rules in a way that is in line with the precautionary approach when we don't really have a full knowledge about how the industry is proposed to operate. However, the greatest challenge really is not writing the laws, but it's going to be, I believe, for the Pacific Islands, actually in implementing those laws. So another aspect of the Deep Sea Minerals project that we're working on, and which a lot of Pacific Island governments are also now focusing on, is building up in-country capacity, human capacity and technical capacity, to be able to implement such policies and laws, and with particular emphasis on effective monitoring and enforcement of the rules. A regulatory regime, it has to have teeth. The laws will set out rules of conduct, but will also impose sanctions and penalties if those rules are not adhered to. And such state enforcement powers could include measures such as, probably a spectrum getting more serious as violations may be more serious. So perhaps starting with warning mechanisms, but building up to, for example, financial penalties, civil or even criminal offences with fines or even prison sentences attached, perhaps, for very serious criminal actions. Also, an important administrative measure that will act as to incentivise compliance and as a disincentive to wrongdoing would also be simply the possibility or the power retained by the government that an exploration or mining licence could be suspended or ultimately terminated early by government in the event of material ongoing breaches of the national regulatory rules by that licence holder company. As well as licensing mechanisms, as mentioned, the national laws will also need to cover environmental management, EIA, and permitting processes, and those would normally be under separate environmental laws and managed by a different part of government, the Environment Department or Environment Protection Agency. Safety at sea is also going to be another area that national law will need to address. Again, potentially a different government agency and a different set of laws that will contain rules looking to protect people working on vessels within the maritime jurisdiction, also looking to protect the rights of other sea users who might be occupying the same ocean space. And then another strand of important national policy and law, by no means the least important, will be for the government to be appropriately capturing benefits to the nation from seabed mineral activities. If a Pacific island does decide to proceed with deep sea mining, then clearly it should only be because and on the basis that this is generating an appropriate level of benefit, an appropriate return to the country and its people for effectively the loss and the sale of those minerals. So the legal framework can encourage mining companies to invest money in the country, perhaps by funding, for example, capacity building exercises, building up the ability of the government itself to be able to regulate and manage the industry, or providing training opportunities either out on the deep sea mineral vessels or sponsorship, study bursaries for skills needed in country. The legal regime can also require a level of local employment or local procurement from the deep sea mineral company. And it's important the legal regime contains also appropriate data transfer provisions to make sure that all the geological and environmental data that the company is collecting through their exploration activity about that country's marine space is properly shared back with the government in an accessible format. And that will also assist government to improve understanding of the national geological resources and associated environment, and will assist inform future management decisions. So those are some sorts of, if you like, benefits that can be captured by the law. But clearly the main benefit that a nation will envisage and must make sure to capture from deep sea mining will be new revenue, new national revenue coming into the country as a result of taxes, fees and royalties paid for those minerals. So each country engaging with the deep sea minerals sector will need to have a tailored and a robust, comprehensive fiscal regime, preferably set by law rather than negotiated on a project-by-project basis, to try to ensure, that there really is a sufficient take back for the country, a proper share of the proceeds of the mining activities. In the policy and law development, consideration is also required as to how ultimately that revenue, when it's obtained by government, how it will be managed. Now, there are many historical examples of what is known as the resource curse. where a country suffers negative effects from the exploitation of its natural resources rather than benefits. And that can include social disruption and conflict, as well as economic downturn. Now, the resource curse is it's a sad and strange phenomenon that where a country is blessed with natural resources, it is actually a curse rather than a blessing. And there are some reasons that this might happen that can be avoided by proper government policy, planning and legal structures. One of the reasons might be due to a failure to invest what is short-term, finite income, to invest it with a longer-term perspective, and also due to failure to manage macroeconomic effects on the country's economy as a whole. So one mechanism that can avoid that would be to put in place robust fund management mechanisms. A ring-fenced sovereign wealth fund is one way to transfer a finite asset, such as a nation's deep-sea minerals, into a different capital asset of the country, a carefully managed and invested fund which can actually exist in perpetuity. The interest can contribute to the annual national budget, and then the capital fund could also be drawn down upon for certain identified national economic development priorities. But basically, a core fund would continue to exist and generate interest so that future generations continue to benefit, and the income from the sale of these mineral resources that may have originally taken millions of years to develop. So that capital and that income continues to exist, and it doesn't just disappear in 1 or 2 generations. So there are several different areas that national policy and law will need to cover in order to set a comprehensive management regime for national deep-sea mineral extraction. The main focus in most Pacific Islands currently is putting in place the licensing and regulatory mechanisms. And this is likely to comprise a number of different stages and processes. Perhaps the state will undertake marine spatial planning and strategic environmental assessment work first, in order to identify which particular sites of the seabed they wish to open for exploration. Once that had been done, then an interested company would be able to make an application to the National Deep Sea Minerals Authority within government, and the company would be required to submit a work plan, which would be considered by government in a due diligence process, with government looking at who are these applicants, what are they proposing to do, and scoring or assessing the application against published, hopefully, criteria, which would include the financial and technical competence of the applicant. If the application is for a mining project or for any other activity that is likely to cause significant impact or harm to the marine environment, then an environmental impact assessment procedure and an environmental management plan would also be necessary. So the government, and probably this would be both the Deep Sea Minerals Regulatory Authority and also separately the Environmental Permitting Body, and they would perhaps draw also on external independent expertise where necessary. They would be reviewing this information received from the applicant and taking decisions whether or not to permit those activities, whether or not to grant a licence, enabling the applicant to proceed in accordance with their application. If the decision is taken to approve the application, then a written licence would be provided, and that would set out particular terms and conditions for the permitted activities. and the company would then proceed to perform the activities and their work plan in accordance with the licence. During performance of the licence, there should be regular reporting from the company on what they're doing, and they should be transmitting to the government also copies of the data that they are gathering. Government should scrutinise that information received and should also be monitoring the company's performance independently, for example, by way of site visits or perhaps having an inspector on board the vessel, or perhaps via electronic means, satellite surveillance, those types of measures. Should the monitoring identify any serious deviation from the terms and conditions of the licence, then appropriate sanctions and penalties proportionate to that breach should be imposed. Oversight of these governmental functions should also be provided by way of the courts, with opportunities for government decisions to be appealed for judicial review by the courts. Also, with as much information as possible being placed by the government and by the licensed company in the public domain to enable other stakeholders, the general public, campaign groups, civil society groups, academics, the international community, and so on, enabling those stakeholders to play themselves a watchdog role, scrutinising what's going on, providing input, advice, raising queries, etc. This can assist the mining companies themselves to be socially responsible corporate citizens, and can also assist government to take the best decisions they can take on the best information available at the current time. And all of those regulatory processes, as I've already highlighted, should be underpinned by legislation, by laws. This makes the rules of conduct transparent. It removes the space for negotiation on individual project-by-project basis also, which is a good thing. Historically, we've seen that mining companies tend to obtain advantages where they enter into negotiations with developing country governments. Having law in place also is likely to be appealing to credible mining companies who would prefer to enter a jurisdiction that has clear rules in place. That provides a degree of predictability and stability for the company also, and for their investment. And just to reiterate some points that I have already made, but which are very important. Before embarking on the grant of licences for individual deep-sea mineral projects, it is necessary for government to design appropriate national policy, law and administrative processes and to implement those. And consultation on those will be important, both across government, involving all relevant ministries such as Environment, Finance, Maritime Authority and so on, as well as the Primary Minerals Authority. But also consultation more widely, putting information, draft policies and draft laws and plans into the public sphere, giving concerned citizens and interested stakeholders adequate opportunity to provide their insights and comments. And that's necessary really to enable government to put in place policy that represents the views and the will of people of their country. And we see that happening in the Pacific currently. For example, the government of Vanuatu has prepared a draft national policy for seabed mining and has published that on their website, invited comments from any interested parties, and is also working with an umbrella non-governmental organisation group to go around each of the different provinces within the country of Vanuatu to hold public consultation events and workshops to go through the policy, provide some information and context, and then to receive views from those present at the workshops. That's a process that is being supported and funded by the SPC European Union Deep Sea Minerals project, and we think it's very important for these thorough processes to be undertaken before a country rushes into any decisions or agreements. And I've also mentioned some other preparatory steps that are recommended to take a wider view of the nation's exclusive economic zone and to conduct exercises in marine spatial planning, strategic environmental impact assessment, aiming to manage the national marine space holistically and putting in place mechanisms that will manage the competing uses and demands and stresses on that ocean space holistically and cumulatively. So those sorts of measures may include the establishment of marine protected areas, as I've mentioned, looking to protect sites of particular biological diversity or particular ecological significance or fragility, and seeking to offset impacts that will occur from permitted marine use, such as seabed mining. And so governments interested in future mining projects may wish to prioritise and invest in those types of wider and more strategic planning activities now before giving go-ahead for any individual projects. And a case study of the types of preparatory actions taken for deep sea mineral sector readiness can be seen in one of the countries taken as an example that I work with, the Cook Islands. The Cook Islands has a very large exclusive economic zone known to be nodule rich. Cook Islands has not issued yet any licenses for exploration or mining within its EEZ, but it is interested to do so in the future, interested in the future economic potential from its nodules. And so current policy is to start with, in the future, incentivising exploration at this stage so that government can gain more information about its geological potential and can start gathering the environmental and biological data that will be crucial in order to inform decision making in the future as and when the possibility of seabed mining arises. So a couple of years back, the project, Deep Sea Minerals project, worked with government to draw up a flowchart plotting all of the different steps that Cook Islands government would work through to set up their deep sea mineral regulatory framework. And this involved at least 18 different processes. And I think that really shows that it is a big job for government to reach regulatory readiness. And each one of those steps is important and mustn't be overlooked or rushed. So we started at number one with finalising the national maritime boundaries. It's obviously important to know where the national jurisdiction lies and where it ends before giving out licences around those areas. We then went through a number of different steps involving policy elements, legal elements, fiscal elements, institutional elements, and environmental management elements. Now, a couple of years down the line, the Cook Islands has actually addressed and implemented many of those already, being the first country, I believe, in the world to have in place a national seabed minerals policy, a national seabed minerals act, a dedicated national regulatory body, the Cook Islands Seabed Minerals Authority, headed by a seabed minerals commissioner, and also national fiscal laws for seabed mining royalties and tax treatment. So you can see that the Cook Islands has been working its way through a number of steps very effectively and efficiently over the past few years. Work is underway currently to develop licensing regulations and EIA and permitting regulations. And then there are two crucial building blocks that underpin all of this work. Firstly, building up the technical and human capacity within government to manage the regulatory role. And secondly, engaging with non-governmental organisations and raising public awareness about this new industry within the Cook Islands. And there's been some great work underway in the Cook Islands in that regard also. I was very pleased to be involved recently in an activity run jointly by the Cook Islands Seabed Minerals Authority and a local conservation NGO, Te Ipu Karea Society, or TIS. So that's a local NGO who have engaged very effectively with deep sea mineral advocacy nationally and also internationally. So Cook Islands Government and TIS together ran a youth debate recently whereby school children in the Cook Islands spent some time learning all about deep sea minerals and then took part in a national debate with teams competing against each other, demonstrating their understanding of the subject and developing persuasive arguments looking at both the pros and the cons of government progressing and moving forward with seabed mining in the Cook Islands. It was a really great initiative, a good way to engage youth who are likely to be the decision makers as the industry develops in the future, but also bringing in the wider community via their parents and their teachers and other audience members. So a really great initiative that we have also seen replicated since in other Pacific Island countries, recently at the University of the South Pacific, based in Fiji. We saw two similar debates, and other countries such as the Solomon Islands and Tonga and others are looking at having similar debates to raise awareness of some of these issues within their countries. So that's really great work that the DSM project is very happy to support. And there's a lot of other activity in relation to deep sea mineral work across the Pacific Islands region. Since the inception of the Deep Sea Minerals Project, national laws have been enacted in Fiji and in Tonga relating to deep sea mineral developments, and draft policies and laws are with Parliament or undergoing consultations currently in another 8 Pacific Island countries. And I think this pioneering policy and law work is not really taking place so much in other regions. And perhaps it's quite unusual that these Pacific small island developing states are at the forefront of the regulation of this new industry. And this has led to suggestions for more formalised regional coordination and harmonisation of deep sea mineral regulatory standards across the Pacific Island region. A sub-regional treaty and secretariat model has already been seen to work effectively in recent years in the Pacific for fisheries, both improving conservation of stocks and also increasing the financial return to Pacific Islands from foreign fisheries. So there's been some suggestion to consider mirroring this arrangement for deep sea minerals. An alternative suggestion has been to establish a regional deep sea mineral regulator, a body that can carry out the technical aspects of deep sea mineral cadastre, licensing, monitoring, enforcement, EIA, and so on behalf of governments across the region. And there certainly are advantages to these ideas. Agreeing minimum best practice performance and environmental management standards that apply across the entire region's EEZs should strengthen compliance and strengthen and bolster monitoring and enforcement capacity. which certainly is desirable. It may also be more attractive to the companies themselves to work in a jurisdiction where the regime is familiar and shared with neighbours, and particularly if there may be transboundary deposits or transboundary exploration cruises. Also, as I've mentioned, Pacific Island countries are generally very small countries with limited government capacity and limited resources. And at this exploration stage of the industry, there aren't royalties or profits to be taxed, so there's very little income coming to governments from the deep sea mineral sector. So rather than seeing individual countries spend their limited state budget now on setting up new structures within government and, for example, commissioning specialist lawyers or economists, scientists, EIA specialists, geologists and so on, one by one, it would seem to be more cost effective if there was a pooled resource of technical expertise on which individual Pacific Island governments can call as and when it's required in their individual circumstances. A harmonised regional approach may also work well to establish a common platform on the international stage. For example, at the International Seabed Authority, if there are 15 Pacific Island countries as a group speaking with a common voice, that really could help assist the particular interests and context of Pacific small island developing states to be reflected and recognised as the international regime develops. So I just really wanted to end on that note of the possible future of very strong deep sea mineral sector management that can be achieved by Pacific Island states, particularly through regional cooperation and coordination. And really the hope is that deep sea minerals can present an opportunity to look past the constraints and the vulnerabilities that are often focused upon with small island developing states, and instead to focus on the benefits that are brought by having such vast ocean jurisdictions. By working together and proactively, Pacific Islands have an opportunity to uphold high standards and best practice in the emerging deep sea minerals industry from the outset. By carefully managing deep sea mineral developments with balanced and thoughtful, precautious decision making, with a focus on good governance, with socially inclusive consultations, with strong legal frameworks in place, and with a focus on building institutional capacity and pooling resources on a regional level, we could see deep sea mining lead to sustainable long-term prosperity across the region. And that's the vision that the SPC European Union project and our 15 government counterparts are all currently working towards. Thank you.